3 years ago, if you had driven past my place on Lake Ashford, you probably would have thought I had everything figured out. Small cedar house, weathered but solid, an old fishing boat tied to the dock, kids laughing every summer weekend, neighbors waving from across the water. It wasn't some millionaire dream house, but it was ours. And after spending almost 20 years working overtime as an electrical contractor, I had finally reached the point where life felt peaceful. Looking back now, I think that's exactly what bothered certain people. Peace seems to make controlling personalities uncomfortable. The first sign that something was about to go very wrong showed up as a bright orange envelope taped right across my front door. I still remember peeling it off while carrying groceries inside, expecting maybe a neighborhood announcement or some community picnic flyer. Instead, in bold black letters, it read, "Notice of Architectural Violation. According to the Homeowners Association, my dock extension violated community regulations and was subject to immediate fines." I actually laughed the first time I read it because I honestly thought someone had made a mistake. About 2 weeks earlier, I'd hired a licensed marine contractor to extend my dock by just a few feet. Nothing fancy, nothing huge, just enough space so my 2 kids could safely jump into the lake without climbing around the boat lift. Every permit had been approved by the county. Every inspection had passed, and the project was completed exactly as the engineering drawings required. I figured one phone call would clear everything up. Instead, that phone call introduced me to the woman who would spend the next 3 years trying to convince everyone she owned the lake. Her name wasn't Karen, at least not anymore. Let's call her Diane Holloway. Diane had been president of the HOA for almost 8 years. She was one of those people who smiled without ever looking happy, the kind of smile that felt more like a warning than a greeting. She invited me to meet her at the clubhouse the next morning, and I walked in carrying a folder full of permits, inspections, receipts, everything anyone could possibly ask for. I barely had time to sit down before she slid the violation letter back across the table. "Your dock stain is darker than the approved color palette," she said without looking up, "and the extension wasn't approved by the architectural committee." I blinked a couple of times because I thought maybe she'd misunderstood. "The county approved it," I replied. "The state approved it. The contractor followed every regulation." She finally looked up at me, folded her hands together, and smiled that same uncomfortable smile. "Mr. Walker, around here, our approval matters more." I honestly thought she was joking. She wasn't. I opened my folder and spread every permit across the table. Engineering drawings, shoreline permits, inspection reports. Enough paperwork to make anyone's eyes glaze over. Diane barely glanced at a single page. Beside her sat the HOA compliance officer, a guy named Brent, who leaned back in his chair and tapped his clipboard with a little grin on his face. "County rules don't override community standards," he said. "The board owns enforcement authority." I asked him a question that would stay in my head for years afterward. "Are you saying the HOA controls the shoreline?" Brent shrugged. "Pretty much everything you can see." That sentence should have sounded ridiculous. Instead, everyone else in the room nodded like it was completely normal. Before I walked out that morning, Diane informed me that the initial fine would be $200 if I didn't remove the extension within 30 days. The amount would double every month until compliance was achieved. She actually used those exact words, like she memorized them from a script. Driving home, I was furious, not because of the money, but because of the arrogance. I'd always believed rules existed to protect communities, not to feed someone's ego. Still, when I pulled into my driveway and saw my daughter sitting on the dock, dangling her feet in the water while my son skipped rocks beside her, something inside me settled down. They didn't need a father who lost control over every unfair thing that happened. They needed one who knew when to stay calm. So I paid the first fine. My wife Emily thought I'd lost my mind. "You're just encouraging them," she said while looking over the payment receipt. "Maybe," I answered. "Or maybe I'm giving them enough rope." She raised one eyebrow because she'd been married to me long enough to recognize that tone. Whenever I got unusually quiet, it usually meant I was already thinking 5 steps ahead. The strange thing was, Diane didn't stop after the first fine. Every month another letter arrived. Sometimes it complained about the dock color, sometimes the railing height, sometimes the extension itself. The reasons kept changing, but the invoices kept growing. $200 became $400, 4 became 8, 8 became 16. Every single payment went into a folder inside my office. Every violation notice, every certified letter, every email, every bank statement. I labeled each one with the date and stored them in chronological order. Nobody outside my family knew I was doing that. As far as the HOA was concerned, I was just another homeowner who had finally accepted defeat. Neighbors started asking why I didn't fight back. Some quietly admitted they'd been fined over landscaping, mailbox colors, even Christmas decorations left up a week too long. One older gentleman named Frank pulled me aside after a community meeting and whispered, "Don't waste your energy. Diane always wins." I smiled politely, but something about that sentence kept echoing in my head. People like Diane only keep winning because eventually everyone decides they're unbeatable. I wasn't interested in proving her wrong overnight. I wanted to understand exactly why she believed she could get away with it in the first place. One evening, while standing at the end of my dock watching the sun disappear behind the trees, I looked down at the water and noticed one small detail I'd somehow ignored for years. The property marker on my survey stopped several feet before the shoreline. My land ended, but my dock continued. And suddenly one question hit me so hard I actually laughed out loud. If my property line ended there, then whose authority was Diane actually trying to enforce? That question stayed in my head for days, then weeks, and eventually turned into an obsession. Every evening after dinner, once Emily and the kids had gone to bed, I'd sit in my little office with a cup of coffee that usually went cold before midnight, surrounded by maps, surveys, permits, and property records. At first, I was only trying to prove Diane was overstepping her authority. Somewhere along the way, I realized I wasn't looking at an HOA dispute anymore. I was looking at a puzzle that nobody in the neighborhood had ever bothered to solve because everyone assumed the board knew what it was doing. The more documents I pulled from county archives, the stranger everything became. The subdivision itself had only existed since the early 1990s, but the lake had been classified as a navigable public waterway decades before that. I found engineering studies, environmental reports, shoreline management plans, and old aerial photographs showing the shoreline long before any luxury homes or manicured lawns had been built. Then I noticed something that made my heart race. Every official document separated private property from the regulated shoreline. The HOA controlled landscaping, fences, paint colors, roofs, and common areas, but nowhere did it say they had authority over structures extending into navigable water once they had been permitted by the proper agencies. I read it once, then again, then 10 more times because I couldn't believe it could really be that simple. I called the county planning office the next morning. The woman who answered listened patiently while I explained my situation. She paused for a moment before saying, "Honestly, sir, that's probably not our jurisdiction anymore. You should speak with the State Department of Natural Resources." That single sentence changed everything. 2 days later, I found myself driving nearly 2 hours to meet a shoreline compliance officer named Laura Benson. She wasn't dramatic. She wasn't interested in neighborhood politics. She simply spread my permits across her desk, compared them with the state's shoreline database, and frowned. "Who's been fining you?" she asked. "My HOA. She looked back down at the paperwork, then back at me. "For this dock? For 3 years." She actually leaned back in her chair and let out a quiet laugh. Not because it was funny, but because she genuinely couldn't believe what she was hearing. "Mr. Walker," she said, "once this permit was approved and inspected, your association had no authority to regulate the structure itself unless there was a separate covenant that somehow survived state law, and I don't see one." I didn't celebrate. I didn't even smile. I simply asked the next question. "Would you be willing to put that in writing?" She nodded without hesitation. A week later, I had an official letter confirming exactly what she'd told me. Most people would have marched straight into the HOA office waving that letter around like a trophy. I almost did. Emily had to stop me. She placed the envelope back on my desk and looked me right in the eyes. "Think about Diane for a second," she said. "Do you honestly believe she'll apologize?" I knew the answer before she finished the question. Diane wasn't the type to admit mistakes. If I showed her that letter, she'd probably invent another violation by lunchtime. Emily reached over and tapped the stack of folders that had grown thicker every month. "Keep letting them talk." That became our strategy. We stopped thinking emotionally and started thinking like investigators. Every violation notice went into the file. Every payment receipt. Every board meeting agenda. Every newsletter where Diane bragged about protecting property values. I even attended meetings where she publicly used my dock as an example of homeowners refusing to cooperate. One evening, she stood in front of nearly 60 residents pointing toward a projection screen, showing a photograph of my house. "This," she announced confidently, is exactly why consistent enforcement matters. I sat quietly in the back row while several people turned around to look at me. Diane had no idea I was recording the meeting exactly as state law allowed. She repeatedly claimed the HOA had legal authority over shoreline structures. Every one of those statements went onto a hard drive that would eventually become evidence. Around that time, I started noticing something else. My dock wasn't the only target. Frank had been fined for replacing hurricane-damaged stairs. A young couple down the street received daily penalties because their boat trailer was visible from one angle behind a privacy fence. An elderly widow named Susan was threatened with legal action because she couldn't afford to replace decorative shrubs after a severe winter freeze. One afternoon, Susan broke down crying while telling Emily she felt like selling her house just to escape Diane. That conversation stayed with me for weeks. This had stopped being about my dock a long time ago. Diane wasn't protecting the community. She was controlling it. Every time someone questioned her, another violation somehow appeared. Every time someone challenged the board, legal threats followed. Fear had become the HOA's favorite management tool. And after enough years, people simply accepted it as normal. I couldn't. I refused to. But I still wasn't ready to move. Instead, I kept collecting. Every month, the fines increased automatically. By the end of the third year, the total had become almost laughable. Thousands of dollars over a dock that every government agency considered completely legal. Friends asked why I kept paying. The truth was simple. Every payment made the case stronger. If I refused, Diane could argue I ignored the rules. By paying every invoice under protest, I documented continuous financial harm while allowing the board to dig deeper into a hole they couldn't even see. Eventually, I scheduled another meeting, this time with the regional office of the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. I expected bureaucracy, delays, maybe another referral. Instead, an engineer named Michael Reyes welcomed me into a conference room filled with shoreline maps stretching across the walls. He reviewed everything for nearly an hour before asking one question. "Has anyone from your HOA ever contacted us?" "Not that I know of." He slowly shook his head. "That's interesting, because if they actually believed your dock violated federal shoreline regulations, this office would have been notified immediately. We have no record of any complaint." Then he pulled up satellite imagery on his computer, measured my dock against the approved permit, and smiled. "You're exactly where you're supposed to be." I asked him the same question I'd asked Laura. "Can I have that in writing?" "Absolutely." When I walked out of that building carrying another official letter, I realized the entire foundation of Diane's authority had just collapsed. She simply didn't know it yet. My attorney certainly did. His name was Daniel Mercer, a quiet man in his early 60s who had spent decades handling complex property litigation. During our first meeting, he barely interrupted me. He read every violation notice, every receipt, every certified letter, every agency response. Nearly 4 hours passed before he finally closed the last folder and removed his reading glasses. "You understand," he said calmly. "This isn't really about HOA fines anymore." "What is it about?" He folded his hands together. "If everything you've documented is accurate, they've knowingly collected money by falsely claiming legal authority they never possessed. That's potentially civil harassment, fraudulent misrepresentation, possibly even mail fraud depending on how the demands were issued." I stared at him without saying a word. He wasn't exaggerating. He wasn't trying to impress me. He sounded almost irritated by how obvious the problem appeared after reviewing the evidence. "Here's what concerns me most," Daniel continued. "They didn't make one mistake. They repeated the same conduct every month for 3 years." That sentence landed harder than anything else I'd heard. 3 years wasn't an accident. It was a pattern, a business practice. Daniel asked one final question before we ended the meeting. "Do you want revenge, or do you want accountability?" I thought about Susan crying in Emily's kitchen. I thought about Frank whispering that Diane always won. I thought about every homeowner who had quietly written checks because fighting seemed impossible. Then I looked back at Daniel and answered as honestly as I could. "I want this to stop happening to everyone." He smiled for the first time all afternoon. "Good," he replied, "because judges can tell the difference." Over the next several months, his office built a case unlike anything I'd imagined. Financial experts calculated every dollar I paid, including accumulated interest. Surveyors recreated the shoreline boundaries using GPS measurements accurate to within inches. Former board members quietly agreed to confidential interviews after learning what we had uncovered. One admitted Diane had repeatedly dismissed legal concerns during executive sessions. Another confessed the board never once consulted state shoreline authorities before approving the enforcement campaign against my property. Every new witness added another brick to a wall that was slowly closing in around the HOA leadership. Then, almost exactly 3 years after that first orange notice appeared on my front door, Daniel called me just before lunch. His voice sounded unusually relaxed. "Everything's ready," he said. "Don't make any plans for next Thursday evening." "Why?" There was a brief pause before he answered. "Because that's the night your HOA holds its monthly board meeting. And I'd really like you to be there when someone walks through the front door carrying a very important envelope." The following Thursday, I walked into the clubhouse feeling calmer than I had in years. Funny how that works. 3 years earlier, I would have walked through those same doors, angry, determined to prove I was right. This time, I didn't need to prove anything. The facts were already doing that for me. Diane stood at the front of the room greeting homeowners with the same confident smile she'd worn for years. When she noticed me, she gave a little nod and said, "Mr. Walker, I hope you're finally ready to discuss removing that dock." I smiled back. "I'm just here for the meeting." She looked almost disappointed. Once everyone settled into their seats, she began talking about property values, neighborhood standards, and the importance of enforcing the rules equally. Then my address appeared on the projector behind her. "Our next violation update concerns the Walker property," she announced. "Since the owner remains unwilling to comply, the board will be considering additional penalties." Before she could finish, the clubhouse doors opened. A man in a dark suit walked down the aisle carrying a large envelope. The room became quiet as he stopped beside Diane and asked her to confirm her name. She answered confidently. He handed her the envelope and simply said, "You've been served." Her smile disappeared instantly. Brent leaned over to read the first page, and I watched every bit of confidence leave his face. A second attorney followed behind, handing identical lawsuit packets to the remaining board members. Nobody spoke. Homeowners looked at one another, completely confused, while Diane frantically flipped through page after page. Within minutes, the meeting was over. No vote, no speeches, no threats, just silence. Over the next several weeks, everything collapsed faster than anyone expected. The HOA's insurance company launched an investigation. The management company hired separate attorneys and quickly distanced itself from the board. Former directors began cooperating after realizing the evidence was overwhelming. Internal emails showed that legal concerns had been raised years earlier. But Diane insisted the board should keep pushing because homeowners always give up. That strategy finally caught up with her. During mediation, Daniel calmly presented every receipt, every violation letter, every certified mailing, every official opinion from the state and federal agencies, and every recording of Diane publicly claiming authority she simply didn't have. The board's attorneys barely argued. They knew a courtroom would only make things worse. Before long, a settlement was reached. Every dollar I paid was returned with interest. The HOA covered all of my legal fees and paid substantial additional damages. More importantly, the association agreed to rewrite its enforcement policies under independent legal review, and every member of the board resigned before the next election. A few months later, I was sitting on the very same dock with Emily while our kids raced across the lake on a brand new jet ski. Frank cruised by in his fishing boat, laughed, and yelled, "Looks like the lake finally belongs to the people again." I laughed too, but I kept thinking about something much simpler. This was never really about money or revenge. It was about reminding people that no title, no committee, and no HOA board is above the law. Real leadership comes from earning trust, not demanding obedience. Looking back, I don't regret being patient. Sometimes the loudest victory comes from saying very little and letting the truth speak when the time is right. Now I want to hear from you. Do you think I should have fought back immediately? Or was waiting the smartest move? Have you ever dealt with an HOA or someone who abused a little bit of power? Share your experience in the comments. And if you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and send it to someone who appreciates seeing arrogance finally meet accountability.